This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 548, entitled Masculist Strategy Towards Blue-Pilled, Unmasculisted Males. Description. This flyer provides a strategy to counter the aggressive reaction of blue-pilled, unmasculisted men in mixed audiences when a masculist is giving a talk. It suggests that the masculist speaker goes straight to the examples of how women oppress men, and for decades, to appeal to the self-interest of these verbally aggressive males who have been taught all their lives that their role in life is to be man-slaves to women, working for women for decades. Now, the flyer itself. Masculist Strategy Towards Blue-Pilled, Unmasculisted Males, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Masculists direct their masculist criticism mostly at women and feminists, but not entirely. When masculists give talks to mixed audiences, often some of the men in the audience will be real blue pillars, that is, men utterly ignorant of masculist and MGTOW ideas, who have been powerfully brainwashed all their lives by society, and especially their mothers, that their role in life is to be a man-slave to a woman, working for her for decades of his life. When such a man hears masculist and MGTOW ideas for the first time in his life, it can go powerfully counter to his self-image, his sense of self-worth, and hence be very psychologically disturbing for him, causing him to feel cognitive dissonance, that is, the psychologically traumatic feeling one has when one's core beliefs are seriously challenged, like going up to a priest and saying to him, quote, "There's no God, you've wasted your whole life," end quote. Of course, such a priest is not going to accept what you say and will just toss off your opinion as nonsense, not giving it any credence at all. Another priest, however, who already has doubts about the veracity of his beliefs, may be much more open to your critique, which might penetrate much more deeply, that could cause a psychological crisis as his self-identity shatters and he has to rebuild himself according to a new model, a painful and depressing process. I have had to deal with blue pillars in the past. In 2019, before the COVID pandemic, I was booked to give a talk to a group of intellectuals called the Melbourne Circle, which holds monthly talks and discussions in the city of Melbourne, that's in Australia. I was asked to give a summary of my talk, which I did, stating the main ideas of masculism. Sometime later, I learned that the chairman of this group, a Chinese man with a PhD and about a decade older than I am, and a friend of mine, had been forced to resign from his position by the committee that consisted of rather blue-pilled men and monoconscious feminists who could not tolerate any ideological criticism coming from a man against women. Masculists are very familiar with the sexist hypocrisy of monoconscious feminists who think that it's okay for feminists to lash out at men for the ways that men oppress women, in brackets, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, etc. But it's not okay for masculists to lash out at women for the ways that women oppress men, in brackets, for example, man-slavery, divorce rape, forced fathering, etc. Masculists are used to this. But when a bunch of monoconscious people of both sexes start feeling hostile towards MGTOW and masculist ideas, particularly towards the very strong masculist criticism of women's man's slavery, etc., then it's often the men in the audience who turn out to be the more verbally aggressive. Women, even ardent feminists, cannot afford to be too aggressive towards a man, since deeply ingrained in women's DNA is an evolved fear of men, since men are 3 times stronger across the chest than women on average. So if a woman really lets fly with her anger at a man, then she risks being physically assaulted by the man she is verbally attacking. And since he is so much stronger than her and has 10 times the testosterone levels in his blood, he can become explosively physically aggressive towards her and do her real physical damage. So women tend to shy away from strong verbal aggression towards men, but men don't have to. So if some of the blue-pilled men strongly disagree with masculist and MGTOW opinions and ideas, then they are in a position to express more freely their strong antagonism than are women. Since if the masculist, who's being verbally attacked by the blue pillar, explodes in a physical rage and tries to physically attack the blue pillar, then the blue pillar, being a man himself, is in literally a much stronger position to defend himself and even inflict real physical damage on the masculist, a possibility which the masculist himself is also aware of, so he will think twice before attacking the blue pillar. Thus, when there is strong opposition and ideological hostility towards the opinions and ideas of the masculist speaker, it's often the blue pill men who offer the stronger criticism rather than the women. Often these blue pill men will feel the impulse to protect the women in the audience from the masculist critique of women. In my own case, I did not even get to speak since the chairman lost his position, in brackets, which he later was invited back to after the masculist kerfuffle had died down, close brackets. Some of the women objected to the masculist description of women, and some of the blue-pilled men refused to let me speak and pushed the Chinese chairman out of his post. So this is an example of the type of opposition to masculist and MGTOW ideas that can come from blue-pilled men who believe their role in life is to be man-slaves to women, to work for women for decades of their lives. So as masculist and MGTOW ideas spread, so that more masculists are invited to speak in public to mixed audiences, how can these masculist speakers cope with the hostility coming from blue-pilled, unmasculisted males in the audience who express their male verbal aggression towards them? Question mark. The short answer is to teach blue-pilled, unmasculisted males, and to teach them quickly, the core ideas of masculism, appealing to the self-interest of the blue pillars. For example, imagine some male feminist, blue pillar male, stands up in the audience and says, quote, "This is unacceptable. This is misogyny. I think you should leave the stage. Your opinions are unacceptable to this audience. You are offensive and should not be speaking to us." End quote. The masculist then has to react quickly, thinking on his feet, by saying something like, quote, "You are what the masculists call monoconscious. That is, you have only heard about feminist ideas and that gender oppression is a one-way street. Well, it's not. Women oppress men too, and in fact far worse. But to see that, you'll need to be familiar with masculist ideas. If you don't know what I'm talking about, take the 3 main ways that women seriously oppress men, that is, with women's man slavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering." End quote. It's likely that the labelling of these three types of major gender oppressions that women commit against men will rouse the curiosity of the audience, who may be wondering, quote, "What are these things this masculist is talking about? I've never heard of them, but I'm curious to listen," end quote. Once the masculist has the attention of the audience and the immediate pressure of the male feminist has been dissipated somewhat, the masculist is now free to elaborate, perhaps as follows, quote, "Masculists claim that women oppress men worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, which makes them more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women that the feminists had been dumping on for 6 decades now, since the start of the second feminist wave." So just what is man slavery and divorce rape and forced fathering? I'll give you a quick summary to give you a taste of what the masculists are talking about. Probably the more familiar you become with these 3 major examples of how women oppress men, you'll become more amenable to hearing masculist ideas and may even become sympathetic to the masculist cause. So, what is man slavery? The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life. Masculists argue that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based medicine and hence a life expectancy today of 85 years. Men gave women the pill, household gadgets, higher education, etc. So women now, with their 0, 1 or 2 kids, have a career window of half a century. So masculists tell women, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is man slavery. And to masculists, man slavery is slavery, and hence hated and a war issue." Masculists place enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, in brackets, equals financially independent persons, close brackets, by bothering to get career competent educations at high school and college, so that they grow up to be real FIPs as adults, pulling their financial weight and not expecting fluffy style, in brackets, fluffy equals, traditional woman who expects to be able to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, close brackets. Thus manslaving him for decades. Masculists see fluffies as the enemy, to be severely punished by not getting a man. Masculists tell young women, quote, "No calculus, no baby. Be FIP or be manless. If you want to get a man, have a career." End quote. Masculists utterly reject women who are not FIPs. What is divorce rape? The feminists took over the divorce courts in the 1970s and made divorce much more favourable to women than for men. The feminists who controlled these courts kept their traditional expectation of men, seeing men as, quote, "existing on this earth to pay for women to have babies," end quote. That is, seeing men as cash machines. So a divorcing father typically loses custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He will lose his house to his ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it. He will lose half his stuff and half his wealth to her. He will be forced to make child payments to his kids, who he will barely be allowed to see. If his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to FIP up and stop parasiting off his money after the divorce, the way she did before the divorce. This form of divorce rape occurs to roughly 1 father in 4, one of the major gender crimes that women commit against men. FIP women, on the other hand, have the ability to earn their own money, so are not manslavers. Masculists want fundamental reform of the divorce courts based on the assumption that all women are FIPs, so that the courts use a financial independence principle that gives custody of the kids jointly by default. Alimony is thrown out and there is no halving of wealth and stuff. What is forced fathering? There are two main types, called pill lying and paternity fraud. A woman who really wants to get pregnant can lie to her husband/boyfriend that she's taking the pill, but isn't, gets pregnant and then forces him to pay for a kid he doesn't want, thus manslaving him for decades. Paternity fraud is when the pregnant woman lies to her husband/boyfriend that the kid growing inside her is his, when she knows that it's not. She thus forces him to pay for decades for a kid that is not even his. Masculists push hard for the legislation of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, which is the male equivalent to the MARA, which women already have, but men don't, close brackets, which would allow a man to fill in a government PARA form, rejecting any responsibility for the kid. The mother then either aborts, or if she continues the pregnancy, then, by law, by the PARA, she then takes full responsibility for the costs of the kid. As a FIP, she can afford to do so. The Masculists also want the legislation of the OPTAB, that's OPTAB, that is obligatory paternity testing at birth, for all births, to block paternity fraud. If the husband learns via the test that the kid is not his, he can use the PARA to avoid paying for it. And if he has clear proof that the wife/girlfriend lied to him about the